Hey pals, I'm here today to do a video I'm really excited about, and that is to continue with my 5-star predictions series. So a few months ago, I spoke about, I think 14 or 15 books that I thought I would give 5 stars based on the premise of the book alone. They were all from writers I hadn't read before, and yeah, I just liked the sound of the blurb, liked the quotes that other authors had put on them, and thought they sounded like books I could really love. I'll link that video above. And then what I did is I read the first chapter or two of each of those books and reassessed my prediction. So whether I still thought they'd be 5 stars or whether based on the writing style I was, a bit less interested in them. And I did a video where I told you my sort of re-ranking of them all, which again I'll link up here. And in that video I ended up deciding that I thought 6 books would still be 5 stars, that 7 books would be between 3 and 4.5 stars, and then a couple books I thought I wouldn't enjoy at all, and so I decided to sort of take them out of the equation. Now, out of the 7 books that I thought would be between 3 and 4.5 stars, I initially wasn't going to read either of the 2 books that I thought would be 3 stars, but one of them, loads of you wrote in the comments that you really thought I would enjoy it, and it was definitely worth trying. So I decided to add that one to the list. The other book I thought I'd give 3 stars. One person commented, said they quite liked it, but it was harder for me to get hold of it. It was quite expensive, so I thought, okay, well, I'll omit that one from the list. So there's 6 books to talk about here, and I'm going to talk about them from my least to most favourite, and I will remind you of what my prediction was for each book. The first book I ended up DNFing, and that is Half a Lifelong Romance by Eileen Chang. This is translated, I think, from the Mandarin by Karen S. Kingsbury. Now, interestingly, I obviously originally put this in a 5-star predictions video, and even when I included it, it was a bit more of an outlier on the list because maybe 8 to 10 years ago I used to read a lot more classics than modern classics, and it's not something I really do much anymore, but it was something I wanted to try and sort of get back into, and out of all the ones I was interested in, this was one of the ones I thought had the best chance of being a book I could love, so I included it. But while I've been doing this sort of reading journey, this is the one that I've sort of been the least inclined to pick up, just because I'm not used to reading these type of books anymore. So I really had to sort of push myself to give this one a go. I ended up picking this up in the last week because I'd read all the others and really wanted to start talking about them. And I managed to read about a third of this, around 100 pages, before deciding to give up on this. And I will say, this is entirely a me thing rather than a book thing based on the 100 pages I read so far, because the premise of this book is that it takes place in 1930s Shanghai, and it's told from the perspective of a young man who meets a woman at work that he falls in love with. She falls in love with him, but you know from the blurb that plenty of things are going to happen in their life, tragic things that are going to stop them from being together, and you follow them over the course of, I think, their whole lives and watch these tragedies sort of keep them apart. And based on the reviews I've seen, this is supposed to be super emotional and really upsetting, and at points quite a heartbreaking read. Now, the section I read, it's quite slow, it's them getting to know each other, it's following them over the course of a few months as they, just start to realise they're falling in love. And what I'll say is that there was no point where I thought this was badly written. There's a couple of sections where the writing's quite romantic, but it's done in, I think, a good way. It's not sort of cringy romantic. And yet I didn't really feel attached to anyone, and I think it's because I don't tend to read books like this anymore. Books of this era tend to be much more formal, and that's something I really don't love in my fiction. And there was a couple of layers of formality in this, in that firstly, clearly in this time period, there is much more of a split between the genders. So, for example, it would be seen as sort of unseemly for a young woman to go out for the day with a young man, sort of unchaperoned, without anyone knowing if there's not marriage intentions there. But then another layer within this society, 1930s Shanghai, is that some people in different parts of China are much more traditional, old-fashioned, whereas Shanghai is much more modern. And so you have this split between different types of tradition, but also classes. And so there's all these additional layers of formality that just really holds me at a distance. And so I was just reading this thinking the writing's good, but I'm just not really connected, and I'm not really interested in reading about this kind of historical world in this tone anymore. And so this is a book I will probably keep, which isn't something I do when I DNF a book usually, because I feel like when I'm back in the mood for this type of book, whenever that is, I think I could really enjoy this. But that isn't right now. I just think right now I'm much more comfortable reading more contemporary fiction. So yeah, I would go look at other reviews of this because I know loads of people love it, just not for me right now. The next one is the one I was most wrong about with my prediction. I thought I would give this one 4.5 stars when I read the first couple of chapters, and I ended up giving it 2 stars. And this is a really mixed bag, a little bit of a messy novel really, so I will do my best to talk about it. And that is Flatlands by Sue Hubbard. So initially I'll explain the plot of this, the premise. This is set during World War II. You are hearing from 2 perspectives. One is a young girl called Frida, who is a London evacuee, and she is sent to the Lincolnshire Fens. And one is a young man in his 20s who is an artist and a conscientious objector, and he has sort of run off to the Lincolnshire Fens to wait out the war, and he is doing manual labour, which was something you sort of had to do if you were a conscientious objector, which isn't something I knew. So you're hearing from both their perspectives, but the framing device of this novel is that Frida is now an elderly lady in a care home in London, and she is looking back on this friendship she had with Philip and how important it's been to her life, and she's sort of reminiscing about this time in her life. And so every now and again you're pulled out of the past into the present, and you hear from Frida's perspective as an elderly lady. The strongest elements of this novel, I think, are the moments in the present day. I think she writes really beautifully about ageing, about a place changing around you. There's a point where she says, "Where have all the Doris has gone?" about like how names are in fashion at certain points, and I just thought that was kind of filled with nostalgia and love and sadness, just this really simple sentence. And then the bits before she leaves London as a young girl, where she describes her life with her mother and her grandmother in this shop that they run, I thought they felt really warm and close and really painted a vivid picture of what life would have been like for working class families in London at the time. However, when she gets to Lincolnshire, she's put with quite a horrible family, but you always kind of feel held at a distance from what's really happening to her. Some quite horrible things happen within this story, but yeah, I felt removed from them. Also, the pacing's kind of odd. Like, you've been quite close to her while she's in London, while she's journeying to Lincolnshire, and then all of a sudden, like, time will kind of jump. You'll feel like there's some tension and something bad's going to happen, and then quite a lot of time will move forward, and that tension's kind of still there. So the pacing of this novel feels off. The other sort of big issue I had with this book is that the way it is portrayed is like this relationship is super important to her life, and even the way she's talking about this as an elderly lady confirms that. But yet their relationship turns out to be not all that important in terms of the time they actually spend together. So you're kind of anticipating all these moments where they get to know one another, and those moments are really fleeting. And then the bigger issue I had with this novel is that you also get Philip's perspective, like I said, and his perspective feels crammed full of the research that the author has done. It feels that she wants you to know, I don't know if it's that she wants you to know the research she's done, but that she's so fascinated by this era, knows so much about it. You know, there's a lot of names thrown at you of sort of upper middle class people, lots of artists and politicians of the day that Philip rubs shoulders with. And it just feels like a constant sense of sort of like name dropping. And I think it really made it feel less like a novel because you could see the writer behind all those names and see how excited she was to kind of cram them in. And so I think Philip ended up feeling quite flat as a character and kind of uninteresting. And there's a section at the end in his story where, again, I won't spoil anything, but he's involved in a kind of historical moment where, again, I feel like the author just wanted a chance to write about that moment, but she hadn't like built enough story and characterisation around the novel to really earn that. So this was a really mixed bag. There was moments of really beautiful writing. Clearly the research had been done, and I was left feeling that this could have been a really great novel if maybe more time had been spent on it, or it had been better edited. So yeah, I don't think I'd pick up another book from this author because it just ended up feeling a bit kind of messy and clunky. It's a shame though, because I do think there probably is a good novel buried within it. Now the next two, I think I enjoyed a similar amount, but I enjoyed them for kind of different reasons. I think one of them had stronger writing, but the other felt more original in terms of the plot and themes it was tackling. So they sort of ended up evening out for me, but kind of for different reasons, like I said. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Where the Trees Were by Inga Simpson. I think I predicted that I'd give this book 4 stars, and this has probably ended up being like a 3.5, 4-star read for me. Now, I'm pretty harsh with my ratings. If I give a book 3 stars, I'm definitely recommending it. I liked it, but maybe it didn't blow me away, or there's something I had an issue with, or like the ending wasn't very strong. If I gave a book 4 stars, then I really enjoyed it. I definitely think it's worth recommending. Sometimes I think it's excellent, but there's like one thing holding me back from saying that it's an absolutely amazing read. So both these books probably sit around the 3.5 stars. Maybe it's more helpful to say that I would read more books from both of these authors. So I definitely enjoyed them enough to continue reading this author's work, which is good with this one because this is one of her novels. She has quite a few out, so I will be seeking out the other ones. So the premise of this is that it opens, I think, in like 2016, something around that timeline, in Australia. And we are following Jane, who is a woman, I think in her early 30s. She works in a museum. She specialises in Australian Aboriginal artefacts. And when the book opens, she is stealing a massive artefact from the museum, and that is an arboglyph. And an arboglyph, and I apologise if I'm saying that incorrectly, is a tree that has carvings on it made a very long time ago by Aboriginal people, and they were usually the marker of an important person within that community having passed on. And she is stealing this tree, getting it out of the museum, and you follow on in the present day as the museum are trying to investigate who could have done this, and Jane is trying to figure out how she can get away with it, and also trying to figure out what the hell she wants to do going forward. You're then hearing about her life as a child. I think it opens when she's around 10 or 11 in the late 1980s. And as you follow her in the past, you get to understand why she wanted to steal that tree and sort of the repercussions of this for her present. So the narrative is split evenly between the two. I love coming of age stories, so of course I enjoyed the sections in the past. Jane has a friendship group where there are 3 boys she's predominantly friends with, and one of them has a younger brother as well, so he spends quite a lot of time with them. In that time period, you see that on her family farm, her and her friends stumble across a grove of trees that have these carvings on them. One of her young friends is from an Aboriginal family, and he understands that these trees are really important, and they agree as a group of friends to always protect these trees, to never betray them, and to make sure they're kept safe. And you can tell that this promise to Jane feels like a promise not just about the trees, but about their friendship and what they mean to one another. So you watch these friends as they grow up, you follow them over quite a lot of years, and you see things like how Jane starts to feel more separate from them, and she starts to notice that she's a girl more and they're boys, and things become a bit awkward between them. And you also follow kind of tragic things that happen in some of their lives and how that affects how they interact with one another. And as you understand this more, you understand Jane's reasonings for what she's doing in the present, but you also follow her in the present as she's dealing with her relationship with her girlfriend and sort of holding this massive secret back from her girlfriend and sort of watching how that affects them both. I found this book entirely readable. Like, it was very easy to read, very easy to turn the pages. I found that I liked all the themes this book was exploring. Like, I've never read a book that deals with arboglyphs before. I thought the discussions this book was making about, these discussions are discussions we keep having, and I think in a fictional sense this handled those discussions well, about the notion that, a lot of museums that are owned and run by white people and that were created through colonialism still have these artefacts that they 100% should not have, and how horrendous that is, how offensive that is, but you are literally holding a marker of the burial place of somebody in a museum. And in a lot of times, something I found interesting and learnt from this novel is that a lot of the times these type of artefacts are actually kept in storage and are never put on show, because these museums understand how sensitive they are now culturally. So they're just in a basement somewhere, like wrapped up, not being seen, not being witnessed, even though they're really important to some people out there. So I think the novel explored all those themes really well. I think this isn't a novel to read if you like a novel that has a lot of plot, because this one really doesn't. I think instead this novel explores this friendship group, explores a life really tenderly and quite carefully. And yeah, I think it was really interesting, and I liked her writing style. The next one is Little Monsters by Adrian Broder. Now, after I read the first couple of chapters, I didn't think I'd like this one very much, which was a shock because I obviously thought this would be 5 stars, mainly because it was getting lots of comparisons to The Paper Palace by Miranda Cowley Heller. That is a brilliant family drama that is set in Cape Cod, and Little Monsters is also a family drama that is set in Cape Cod, so I was really interested in it. But when I read those first 2 chapters, they're from the perspective of a father who is nearing 70 and his son who is perhaps in his late 30s, early 40s. And they are both kind of despicable, incredibly privileged, misogynistic, arrogant, rude, just horrible men. And I really didn't like being in their heads. And I kind of felt like, I don't know how interested I am in hearing about the concerns of these incredibly privileged people. So I didn't really want to read this one, and I changed my prediction to a 3-star rating. Then a lot of you in the comments said, no, I really do think you'd enjoy this one. The book is examining their privilege, and you know, there's other characters who you do actually like. And so I thought, okay, I'll give this one a go. I ended up, like I said, enjoying this much more than I expected, and I would definitely read another book from this author. This is her debut novel. So the premise of this is you are following 4 perspectives. One of them is an older father who's about to turn 70. He has decided to come off his medication for bipolar disorder, I believe, and things are starting to kind of unravel. His middle-aged son and daughter have a really tense relationship for lots of really complicated reasons, which are explored throughout the novel, and I think are kind of the main focus of this novel. And they are both trying to arrange his 70th birthday party. And there's a 4th perspective from a woman who I believe is a similar age to them, and I think she's from Brooklyn. She is married, and her and her wife have recently had a baby, and she is a police officer, so she's from a kind of really different background to these characters. But she comes to Cape Cod every summer and stays in this holiday home, and she is heading there this summer, but she wants to find out some things about this family for reasons that are revealed fairly early on, but I don't really want to spoil them for you. I think the addition of her as a character is very needed, because if not, you're in the head of these really privileged characters. Now, the daughter has chosen to live her life in a really different way to her father and brother, because she is an artist and she lives in her studio and doesn't make a lot of money, and yeah, really wants to live a very separate life from them, but she's still sort of historically from privilege, and you know that if she needed to, she could have access to a lot of money. So yeah, I think this 4th perspective is really needed. This novel is very honest in its portrayal of men, especially men of a certain background. Like, pretty much all the men in this novel are intensely unlikable, and all the women in the novel are... This book is really nuanced. Like, the book really examines all the flaws, but yet the reasons for the flaws of all the characters. And I think the women aren't simple in any means. They're all really complex. But I think the book is more interested in women and how they are restricted and contained by men, and yeah, the effects these men have had on their lives. And yeah, so it builds towards this 70th birthday party, and you can just see that like loads of shit's going to kick off, which it does in quite an epic fashion. Now, this book feels like Big Little Lies. Like, if this was made into a TV show, I feel like that same production company could do a really good job of this. Like, it very much has similar vibes in terms of like class and wealth, and it's examining some really interesting family dynamics. So yeah, I ended up really enjoying this, like I said, and I definitely recommend it. Ended up being like a 3.5-star read for me. Now, the next one I initially thought would be a 5-star read based on the premise, because I love books like this. I love sort of literary thrillers and would love to read even more of them. But then when I read the first couple of chapters, I thought the writing style was good, but there was nothing particularly sort of special about it. So I reduced my rating to a 4-star. I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. And this is the type of book that I do love and will 100% reread, would happily reread right now. But I shy away from giving it 5 stars because it's not the type of book where I pause to reread sentences because they're beautiful. And for me, a 5-star book kind of has to have that. Maybe that's unfair of me because books are trying to do different things, and this book, the plot and the themes and the way those things are explored, I think is excellent, and perhaps I should think that's enough for a 5-star read. So what I'll say is I loved this book, and if you like the sound of it, I'd highly recommend it, and I'll definitely reread it, and I'll definitely read whatever this author brings out. So this is so far one of my favourite reads of the year, and that is The Damages by Genevieve Scott. Now, initially, I'm going to cop out a little bit, and this is something I pretty much never do. I'm going to read you the blurb of the book I've actually read. And my reasoning for that is because I really don't want to spoil something And I think it would be really easy for me to spoil, but they've done a really good job of not spoiling it on the back. So I'm going to read the back. 1998, Ontario has been hit by a days-long, life-endangering ice storm. And on Regis University campus, with classes cancelled, the students are partying. Amid it all, 18-year-old Roz's roommate Megan goes missing. As a panicked search ensues, Roz is blamed for not keeping a closer eye on Megan, and the incident casts a shadow over the next 2 decades of her life. 2020, Roz's former partner Lucas, the father of her 11-year-old son, is accused of a sexual assault. The accusation brings new details of an old story to light, forcing Roz to revisit a dark moment from her past. Roz must take a hard look not only at the father of her child, but also at her own mistakes, her own trauma, and at the supposedly liberal period she grew up in. And there is a quote on the front of this which I entirely agree with, and I need to look into this author, because when an author writes a good quote like this, I'm interested in their work. One of the first novels I've read that does a brilliant job of unpacking the duplicity and dishonesty of the 1990s. The damages held me riveted in a tight, icy grip. And that's Claire Cameron who said that. So tell me if you've read a Claire Cameron book. Yeah, I just loved it. I had a blast reading this. Now, it is set in part during an ice storm, so like perhaps it's a better book to read in the winter, but I read it across a few sunny days and still super enjoyed it. I love books like this, and the reason I picked this one up and predicted it would be 5 stars is because I read I Have Some Questions For You by Rebecca Mackay last year. Really loved that. That would have been a 5-star read for me if it wasn't just for some kind of tiny little bits of clunky writing that made me cringe a tiny bit, and maybe the ending being just a little bit frustrating. But this has a really similar premise, right? This incident that takes place in a kind of educational setting where the students are living there. A young woman who is involved somehow in that incident, who is somehow linked to it, and then her looking back on that incident from the present. And also both of them have the protagonist's husband is being accused of something. So they have kind of similar premises. Now, these books would have been written around the same time, so there's no way I think either of them are inspired by the other. But I think if you enjoyed one of them, you'll definitely enjoy the other. I think this is definitely the stronger novel, and I think this really focuses in on the way in which we view sexual assault and the way in which that has changed in the last few decades. And I think the nuances of that are really well investigated in this book and make you feel kind of icky and uncomfortable thinking about the way in which our language about sexual assault has changed over the decades. So I love boarding school, a college setting. I don't think they're all done well, however. I think this really is done well. This opens when a young Roz is being dropped off at college by her father, and she has decided that she wants to be cool at college. She's never been cool before, and she wants to be viewed as cool, and she thinks the only way to do that is to surround herself with cool people, because if you have cool friends, people around you will assume you must be cool, because if not, why would those cool people want to spend time with you? So this is excruciating to watch Roz really turn herself inside out to try and be a person she's not, to the point where she doesn't really know who she is, you don't know who she is, and that continues into her life as an adult. And I think this book is brilliant at that. Now, you don't like Roz really at any point in this novel, and some people might find that difficult, and sometimes I don't love an unlikable character, but I think this is when it's done really well, because you don't truly understand Roz's intentions. You don't know at certain points whether that's really her opinion or like a natural thing she would have said, or whether that's her still doing what she thinks the people in the room will want her to do and say. And so it adds such a layer of complexity to every moment. And then on top of that, her looking back at this awful moment and trying to unpick in the present day timeline what was true about how she felt about that moment at the time and what is actually false and instead is like the lies she's told herself over the ensuing years. And I think that was really interesting to pick apart as well. There's a really interesting examination about memory and about perspective and about how these things can really shift over the years, about how certain things can be so important to you when they happen and you think they're really important to everyone else around you as well, but then to find out that some of those people thought those things were completely forgettable and meaningless and they've never thought about them since, and how kind of soul crushing that can be. So I really loved this book. I enjoyed spending time in both perspectives. In the present day, it takes place during the first year of lockdown, and Roz is living in a lake house with her son and her mother, who she has a really complicated relationship with, and she's trying to decide how to deal with these accusations against her husband and like what she wants to do with her life moving forward. So I think this book just does a brilliant job of examining all those themes I've discussed, and I had a blast reading it. I think it's super readable, and I think this is where I struggle when I rate books, because like I said, sometimes I only want to give books 5 stars if like on a sentence by sentence level they're really beautiful, but there's not a single sentence in this book where I was like, oh, that was awkward or that was bad. Like, this was really well written. It's just like kind of beautiful lyrical writing isn't what this book's going for, but what it does do really well is examine all the themes, and I could completely picture everything. And yeah, I just loved it. I've just seen another quote on the back, which I think probably does a much better job of explaining what I've been trying to say. A probing, courageous work, a dance along the tightropes of memory, justice and love. It explodes the myth of the innocent bystander and ultimately celebrates the lifelong moral challenge of learning who you really are. So yeah, if you like the sound of that, definitely give this book a read. The final book I'm going to talk about, I did give 5 stars. I predicted I would give it 4.5 stars after reading the first couple of chapters, because I just wasn't sure if the writing itself was strong enough for me to give 5 stars, like what I've previously discussed. I was wrong, absolutely. Love this book, and like I said, did give it 5 stars, one of the best books I've read so far this year. And that is The Road to Dalton by Shannon Bowring. I listened to this on audio and it was narrated by Patricia Shade, and I loved it. I heard Rick McDonnell talk about this one, otherwise I would have had no awareness of this novel, and I'm so glad he raved about it because, like I said, it was a joy to read, and I found myself thinking about these characters and this community a lot since reading it. They just spring to mind and I really want to spend more time with them. So I'm very, very happy to know that there is a sequel coming out in a few months that I think will follow some of the same characters, which is just so exciting. I would happily reread this, but it's also nice to know that we're going to get like more stories from these people. The premise of this is that it takes place in a small town in Maine in the 1990s called Dalton. We are learning about the community of Dalton through multiple perspectives, maybe 6 or 7 perspectives, and they are all linked in some way. So if you don't like multiple perspective novels, this may not be for you, but for example, let me see if I can remember how they're all linked. There is a husband and a wife. Then there is the wife's best friend and secret lover. There is that woman's son, his wife, and a co-worker. And then the final person is a teenager who lives in the community. He's around 15 or 16. And he is not as linked to everybody else, but there are several scenes in the novel where he interacts with some of those other characters I've mentioned. And through all of their perspectives, you really get a feel for what it would been like to live in this type of town in Maine in the 1990s. And yeah, this book is very much slice of life, very thematic and very interested in the characters. There is lots of dialogue, there is lots of scenes of people sitting at their kitchen table with coffee and having a chat, or people driving in their car and thinking, or people going out for a meal and bumping into one another. This book is very much about this community and how they can both uplift and fail one another in rather tragic ways. This book has some definitely upsetting content, and there is a section in this book, a perspective, where you kind of have your heart in your mouth the whole time you're reading it, because you can see as a reader what's going to happen, but nobody else around this character can. And you're screaming at everybody to see what's going to happen. And yeah, it's rather hard, and there is a very hard-hitting scene with that storyline that I will never forget. I could picture everything. Like, even now, having finished this book a couple of months ago, I can see the roads that were described, even down to like the ruts in the pavement that were described. I can picture them. I can picture all the open land, all these houses, all these gardens, all these kitchens. There's lots of scenes in kitchens, which I really loved. And I just thought this was wonderful. I think this does a really brilliant job of examining many things. What it's like to be queer in a community like this. There's a couple of characters in the novel who are secretly queer and feel like this is something they're never going to be able to live with openly. You're also following a couple of marriages that are clearly really struggling but these people feel like this is just something they have to put up with. So you're watching a lot of people kind of just make it through life and not feel completely miserable, but also not ever feel content and kind of feel that things haven't worked out how they hoped they would. But they're also not really doing anything about it because it's just what they've come to expect from life. And it is just a beautiful look at this community. And even though lots of sad things happen, I felt so much joy reading this, and I loved it, and I cannot wait to read the sequel that's coming out in a few months. So happy to see the sequel. So yeah, I would highly recommend this book if you like anything I've just mentioned. If you like small town dramas, if you like books set in kind of rural settings, if you like books that are multiple perspective, this book does that brilliantly. If you like books about community and people's entanglements with one another, any of those things, I think you would really love this book. And I just thought it was just wonderful and would reread it in a heartbeat. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the 6 novels that I read for this challenge. I have 6 more to read that I thought I would give 5 stars even after I read the first couple of chapters. So I'm so excited to get to them, and hopefully we'll get to them in the next couple of months and come back to you, hopefully with a video where I say I just read 6 5-star books. How wonderful would that be? So yeah, thanks so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts if you've read any of these books. I'd also, of course, love any recommendations for books like these last 2 in particular. And like I said, I really enjoyed them, and I would love to read more books like this, kind of literary thrillers or small town dramas. Loved both of these books thematically and would love to read more books like them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.